Have you ever wondered why things just fizzle out with a girl, or you can't close on the first night, or she ends up ghosting you? If you ever wondered why, the reason is not really that complicated. You did not provide the fantasy. See, the thing is, women love the fantasy, okay? Now, let me explain what that means. Women will always desire fantasy over reality. Now, let's break it down. What is fantasy? Fantasy is perfection. And what does perfection represent? Value. And what do women prize the most? Value. Because of hypergamy, right? When a woman is looking for a potential mate, she looks for the most valuable mate that she can find, because that will ensure the most prosperous future for her and her offspring. So value is important. What's more valuable than perfection, right? Even though it doesn't exist, even though it's not real, women love the fantasy because it represents the highest form of value, which is perfection. It's very easy to make a woman become smitten with you, fall in love with you, if you give her enough fantasy. What I mean by that is, if every time you guys go out to any type of date, it's always an experience, right? Something that she can tell her friends about. Oh, guess what he did this time? Guess what he did this time? Guess where he took me here? And it doesn't even have to be like anything crazy or expensive. It just has to have some semblance of romance, right? Even if it's a small thing. Like, for example, picnic in the park while watching the sunset. That's relatively inexpensive, but it's still a fantasy. Now, here's the problem that most men run into. They don't understand that when you are dating a woman, you need to limit how much reality interferes with the fantasy. What this means is that, you know how when women say, oh, that killed the mood, or that killed the vibe. What it really means is that it ruined the fantasy. It interrupted the fantasy. Because remember, women will always prefer fantasy over reality. Always. If they have the choice, fantasy over reality every day. For example, let's say you're picking a girl up, you're going on a date with her, right? And as you're driving to wherever venue you are heading to, you get a flat tire. That is reality. More times than not, if you were planning to hit that night, you've just lost because you just hit her with too much reality. Even if you replace the tire, put it back on, you gave her too much reality. You're at the date. Let's say it's a dinner, right? Which I wouldn't recommend on a first date, but let's say you're doing that. Talking to her, everything's going great. The check comes, you don't even look at it, you hand the card, and then a waiter comes back and tells you your card declined. That's a dose of reality. The date was going smooth. It was within the fantasy. But that little card decline, a check of reality, that ruins the flow, gives her a reality, and turns her off from you. So what you want to do ideally is to have little to no hiccups during the interactions with the person. The more that you can make it like a fantasy, like a movie, like a book she read, like a TV show she watched, the more she's going to think that you are the best guy, that you're the bee's knees, all that stuff, right? But you got to remember that life doesn't work like that. Life is going to throw you curveballs. Life is going to make it difficult. So the best thing to do is to limit as much as possible the amount of reality the woman has to experience. That's always going to be the goal. The more you make it like a fantasy, the less she'll have to worry about reality checking. Now that you understand that reality is something that the woman will actively try to avoid, know that every woman has their own reality threshold. What do I mean by that? No matter how far along you are with the woman, whether it's the first date, whether it's the 10th date, whether it's your girlfriend, whether you're married, at a certain point, you will reach the reality threshold. She's experienced too much reality with you, not enough fantasy. So what's going to happen is when you break the reality threshold, the hypergamy reignites, reactivates, restarts. What that means is that she's experienced too much reality. Okay, his car broke down. He couldn't get it up during sex. I had to pay the bill this month. He was late. We haven't had sex in a while. When's the last time he took me out? Too much reality, okay? The threshold has been reached. So now she's like, okay, all I get is reality from this guy. So I'm gonna start looking for other dudes that can provide me with the fantasy. So how do you mitigate this? Well, you have to constantly replenish the fantasy meter, right? Because just like there's a reality threshold, there's also a fantasy gauge, so to speak. You have to constantly replenish the fantasy gauge to mitigate the risk of her reaching her reality threshold. So for example, say that you haven't taken her on a date in, let's say, 2 months, and she's bored because all she's experiencing with you is reality. Instantly say, hey, I booked a trip to this island. We're going here for 4 days. Get dressed, pack your things, we're going. That is a fantasy. What that fantasy now has done is that has, I'm not gonna say completely wiped away, but it has greatly diminished the potency of the reality she experienced for the last 2 months. You always want to have a nice chunk of your relationship within the fantasy. Also, you have to know that the fantasy doesn't just have to be pleasant emotions, okay? One time, I had a girlfriend back in high school, right? And my mother did not want us to be together. I mean, looking back, my mother had obvious reasons for that, but she didn't want us to be together, so we had to break up. And before we did it, one final straw that my mother did wouldn't allow us to be together. And I remember I was in the hallway telling her about it, and she started crying, and then she held me, right? And I held her, and I just rubbed her and told her how much I loved her and that I'm here for her, right? Now, this was not a pleasant experience, but because that sounds like something out of a fucking movie, it was a fantasy. And later on, she told me how even though the emotions she was feeling was terrible, she still found enjoyment from the experience. She still said, even though I was in pain at the time, I still really liked that experience. It was so perfect. Key word, perfect. So even if the fantasy is not a pleasant fantasy, it still can stimulate her enough to where she's okay. If you ever want to know, okay, what is too much reality, what is too much fantasy, look at all the shows and movies that she watches. What do you see happening in those shows and movies? Best thing that you can do is to try to emulate that as much as you can when you can. Because if you do the exact same thing that some guy did in a movie one time that she watched, she's gonna think you're the most romantic guy ever. Because a movie is a fantasy. It's not reality. It's not real. It is the caricature of real life. It's not ever going to be how life really goes, but it's how people wish life could be. So any type of romantic movie or anything that she watches, notice when she says, oh, that's my favorite romantic comedy or whatever. Watch it. Look at what happens in it. And you'll notice that, oh, this is what she thinks is perfection. If you emulate just one or two of those things within that movie, he's gonna fall deeper and deeper into it with you. Now, I also want to let you know that it is so easy to introduce fantasy into it. I'm gonna give you guys just a quick tutorial how to make a woman blush in 20 seconds. So let's say you're on a date with a girl. You're having a conversation. It could be about anything. Doesn't matter what it is. What I want you to do, pause mid-sentence. The pause gets her attention. Just look at her. Just really deep in her eyes. Just look at her. Don't stare. Just look, like really see her, right? Just say this. Man, you are just everything. And she'll blush really quickly. And you know what's funny? What does that mean? That doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean anything. But It sounds like it was out of a fucking movie, doesn't it? But it doesn't mean anything. What is that, right? It's not real. It's a fugazi, right? But she's blushing because women do not like reality, bro. Think about it. Why do you think that women hate dick pics but love dick prints? The dick pic is the reality. The dick print is the fantasy. Because even though she can see the outline, she can't really see it. So she can allow fantasy to make up a picture, a perfect picture to her. But with the dick pic, there's no fantasy. It's just reality. She sees your dick for what it is. No mystery, no nothing. She can't make it perfect in her head because it's staring her right in the face. That's why women hate dick pics. Okay? If you want to send a woman something, send her it where you show your prints, not where you show your dick. Okay? Let her use fantasy to make your dick bigger, better than it ever is. Use the fantasy to work with you, not against you. Now, keep in mind, for me, even though I'm telling you all of this, I don't provide fantasy unless it's earned. I don't provide romance unless they've earned it. Okay? I'm gonna be myself. If reality comes in, I'll handle it, but I'm not going above and beyond to provide fantasy unless the woman reciprocates in some way or she earns it. Now, it's up to you. If you are wondering why your relationship is currently sexless, your marriage is currently sexless, you struggle to maintain more than 3 dates with a woman, you are not providing enough fantasy. Simple as that. Simple as that. For my niggas in sexless relationships, you probably gotta take her on a date that you saw straight out of a movie. Watch a couple romantic comedies, not for pleasure, for research, right? Look at what they've done. Replicate one of those things, back in your good graces. For my niggas in the marriages that are sexless, well, probably not providing fantasy in form of sex, so you gotta fuck her somewhere different. You can't fuck her in the same position, you can't fuck her in the same bed, you gotta fuck her somewhere else. Maybe on the counter, maybe in the car, maybe in public, you gotta figure it out. But you need to inject fantasy into your relationship, okay? Before it's too late. Because if the woman experiences too much reality for too long, you can't fix it. It becomes unfixable. And at that point, you have to end the relationship. So what you want to do always is have a constant level fantasy, reality. Always have more fantasy than reality within the relationship. You don't ever give her too much fantasy because then she will take you for granted and she'll become spoiled. You never give her too much reality because then she will become bored and she'll look elsewhere. That's actually worse than if she's spoiled, okay? You need to give her a good amount of fantasy with a decent amount of reality. Now, the reality for checking, because whenever she takes you a little bit too much for granted, you check her with some reality. You have to use reality to check her, but you cannot use reality to be with her. It has to be more fantasy than reality. If you find yourself giving the woman too much reality, what you need to do is create a little bit of distance and immediately inject some fantasy. Immediately, okay? Something spontaneous, something out of the box, something that's out of character for you totally. Will stimulate her. But if it's just all reality with fantasy, maybe once every 6 months, once a year, the woman's gonna get bored quick, fast, and in a hurry. Wanna wonder why the honeymoon phase doesn't last? Because all the fantasy has now been expunged from the relationship, and you, as the man, don't do your job to continually inject more fantasy. Because the woman is never gonna inject fantasy into a relationship. She's not gonna do that. Not her job. She doesn't want to create her own fantasy because it doesn't stimulate her. She wants to be within it. She wants to be put into it. She wants it to be created for her. If you are wondering why your woman is losing interest, why she's becoming bored, why she's acting bitchy, you have not put in enough fantasy into the relationship. So you gotta put more into it, okay? Because if you don't, then she's gonna start looking elsewhere for other men that can provide her with the fantasy that you lack, okay? And in conclusion, just to explain why this is the way this is, women operate primarily off of emotion, right? Emotion is potent. Emotion is stimulating. And fantasy stimulates emotion like nothing else because it's not real, okay? Women are primarily designed to function optimally on fantasy. Fantasy just hits all the emotional notes, but reality is boring, lackluster, disappointing. That's why men are designed to deal with reality, because reality is logic. Logic, most times, is boring. Men are equipped to deal with that because men are more logically based. That's why men will always prefer more reality. Women will always prefer more fantasy. Think about it. Just like how I said, women prefer the dick prints over the dick pic, a man will prefer a nude over a woman in a dress. Because the nude is the reality. The dress is the fantasy. That's why women will always prefer to read erotic novels and men will always prefer to watch porn, right? And are visual because we like reality. We like logic. We're like, oh, this is what it is. This is how it is. That's my jam right there. Women, it's like, this is how it could be. This is what it could be. This is what I want it to be. That's their jam, right? So that's basically how it works. Her job as the man is to not let the relationship get grounded too much in reality, because then she will leave you. Or she'll just cheat on you, to be honest with you. So take anything else from this, just remember, fantasy, reality. Bring it up a little bit, but never exceed. If there's too much reality, he's gonna start to look around. I hope that helped. Hope that gave you guys some insight. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. You're welcome.